time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you say, by George, I think he's got it. Now, here's George.
Well, hello, hi, how are you? And welcome to another podcast by George. We've got a special guest today, and it's going to be on a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, and it's something that you hear about on the podcast all the time, and that's the climate crisis. They're calling it the climate crisis now, and rightfully so, instead of just climate change. I've always said that, you know, there's two things that are going to get us killed. One of them might be Trump and his foreign relations, and we could have inbound missiles right now. We wouldn't know it, like the people in Hawaii and Tulsi Gabbard's district. That could get us right now. And then I used to say longer term, it's climate change. It's climate crisis that's, the big thing looming out there. But it's looming large. It's getting closer all the time. And I was watching the Jimmy Dore show, which is a program that I really like. It's a YouTube show actually, and if I could, I would encourage you to check that out. And on comes a guest, Pramilla Malick, and she's in New York State. She's an activist on the climate crisis. She's run for the state legislature out there. And I told my wife after I saw the interview with Pramilla, I said, this woman could very well be regarded in the future as the Paul Revere of our time because of this crisis that's looming. So let's welcome her in here and ask a couple of questions. Pramilla, how's your day going?
It's going great. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, tell us the situation in New York State, first of all, because I think our listeners, and I know I was completely unaware of what you're dealing with out there. Something has just happened which has grave consequences for the climate, not just where you're at, but everywhere. Explain that to us.
Right. So New York State is known around the country, or is considered around the country, to be an environmental leader and a climate leader. We just passed a climate bill that was declared by the New York Times to be the boldest climate bill in the entire world, which is a pretty strong statement. But in fact, New York State is expanding its use of fracked gas. It has gone from the fifth largest consumer of gas in the country to the fourth largest consumer, and is on target to be the largest consumer of fracked gas in the country. And fracked gas is actually the number one threat to the climate today. It is not coal, it is not oil, it is fracked gas. And New York State is just adjacent to Pennsylvania, which is an extraction state. It is where a lot of Marcellus shale fracked gas is being extracted. Ohio and Pennsylvania really sit on top of the Marcellus shale. And because of that, New York State has become a critical transportation corridor for the industry, for the fracking enterprise, but it's also been a huge consumer of frack gas. It's served as a market for frack gas. And both of those policy decisions really fly in the face of its proclaimed environmental and climate leadership. And that's kind of, what I've been struggling with in the climate change fight is this, the deception of climate change activists or NGOs or environmental groups that, who say the right things about identifying the magnitude of the problem of the climate crisis, but then lead people to ineffective or completely wrong solutions to fight the climate crisis. And that's kind of what I've been fighting for the last 8 years in New York State.
And this current situation, this plant, this operation that's just coming online, this is not a small deal, right?
It's not. So let me just backtrack a little bit for your listeners. I became involved 8 years ago when I got a letter in the mail that my new neighbor was going to be a gas compressor station. And it turns out that and I live in a pristine, protected agricultural district, largely rural area.
Yeah, so do we.
And a massive, I'm sure you have a lot of listeners who live in rural areas. Like, how would they feel tomorrow, a massive industrial facility was sited literally across the street from them. So that's what I was facing, and that's how I kind of got involved, and I thought to myself, well, how is this possible? We're a protected agricultural district. It didn't belong here. And that's when I began to realize that there is this national agenda underway to make the entire country dependent on fracked gas. And that's when I learned about fracking. Fracking is a very relatively new process that really began to be used about 10 years ago in the United States. There are a couple of places across the country that are fracking extraction centers, Pennsylvania, Ohio being one of them, Texas another one, the Dakotas and Wyoming being other locations. But these are just the extraction areas. In order to get that gas, that fracked gas to market, they need to build a vast network of infrastructure, which includes pipelines and compressor stations and storage facilities, processing plants, and then eventually power plants, and then eventually LNG terminals that are sited all over the country. If you look at a map of interstate gas pipelines, they just blanket the entire country.
Yeah, a lot of people
so
do not.
It really.
They don't realize that, and people in the heartland don't realize that, and they don't realize that didn't just happen yesterday. Those pipelines were put in place under the Obama administration, right?
Absolutely put in place under the Obama administration. And that's, when I kind of confronted that reality and the unwillingness of our elected officials from both political parties to protect basic public health and safety, it was just a skip. One step from there is really climate change, which is the public health and safety of humanity at large at stake. So first they sacrifice the health and safety of our community, but if if you really kind of extrapolate from that, what they really are doing is risking and sacrificing the health and safety of all of humanity, because climate change is here. It's manifesting right now, and you see that through these massive storms and weather events, earthquakes and wildfires, and rising sea levels, and you see that through massive ecological collapse and species extinction, and we're losing ice on both poles very rapidly. There will be no ice in the Arctic by 2022, according to one scientist. Glaciers are melting. These are all uncharted, waters that we are headed towards. And a lot of people have used the analogy of, it's like we're on the ship of the Titanic and it's sinking. And the environmental groups and, the centrist Democrats, forget about, rabid Republicans who don't believe in climate change, because they're irrelevant in this conversation right now. But the people who should be acting responsibly, the Democrats, people who should be, protecting the environment, they're just rearranging the decks on the chairs, the chairs on the deck of the Titanic. That's all they're doing.
That's a good description.
So very few.
Now, the one thing I wanted to bring in here, and another big reason that I wanted to have you on my show, is you said something that I've been echoing for a long time. Whenever you read what the climate scientists say, if you believe these men and women and they're almost unanimous about the severity of this looming climate crisis, they talk in terms of mostly 7, 8, 10, 12 years out, maybe a little bit longer, maybe a little bit less, but they always say their estimates are conservative. Everybody misses that. These are very conservative. It could be much worse, much quicker than what we've been led to believe, correct?
It absolutely is much worse. As I said in the interview, scientists can't even keep up with the data as it's coming in so rapidly, and every time they go out and they evaluate a glacier, it's always worse than they expected. There's more permafrost loss than they expected. So we really need to extrapolate from there, and we need to understand fundamentally that this election in 2020 is the single most important election of our lifetime for the survival of humanity and for the survival of life as we know it. And if we want our children not to inherit an absolute nightmare, we must be very responsible in how we vote in this election in 2020. And climate change must be, in my opinion, the most important, singular, non-negotiable issue that people vote on.
You know, I got a chance to question Jay Inslee a little bit, and he's staking a lot of his candidacy on the climate crisis, and good on him for doing that. But I don't think he even understood the imminent danger that's being posed by the climate crisis. I asked him, what the timeline was for this, and I told him, I said, some people are saying 7 years, and he said, well, we're not going to stop after 7 years. We're going to keep going and try to fix it long after that and long after that. Well, it's possible we may not. There's that scientist from Harvard that is really ringing the alarm bell. Is that right?
Yeah, his name is James Anderson, but what we really should be paying attention to James Hansen, who was the first scientist, NASA scientist, to sound the alarm about climate change decades ago, decades before anyone even knew about it. He defined what it was. He defined the phenomena. And we really should be listening to him. I mean, he's in his 80s. He's old now. He should be writing policy on climate change, not special interest groups, not environmental groups. And I'll tell you something about Inslee. And this is for every candidate. Forget about their record. I mean, their rhetoric. Do not pay attention to their rhetoric, because any candidate can put their finger in the air and see which way the political winds are blowing and tell you exactly what you want to hear. Look at their record. Inslee supported an LNG port, fracked gas LNG port, in his home state for years. And he only came out against it when he decided to run for office for president. So as far as I'm concerned, he has a terrible record on climate change. And I really think, I have to be honest, I think this is a Democratic Party strategy to usurp the climate vote away from Bernie and away from Tulsi Gabbard. In my opinion, the only two candidates that have any commitment to doing what's necessary to address the climate crisis.
Well, I'm with you, and we've talked about it on the podcast before. I'm a big Tulsi Gabbard fan. I mean, I like her a lot, if for no other reason than she's the most jarring juxtaposition to the policies that are currently in place and Donald Trump. She's everything that guy and those guys aren't. And even when it comes to the climate crisis and the Green Deal, I remember she said, that wasn't enough. We need to go beyond that.
Absolutely. She's 100% correct. And I agree with you. I think she is a tremendous candidate. She's an incredible candidate. I would love to see her and Bernie team up together. I'm a supporter of both of them. I think they're great. Both of them are great candidates. I met Tulsi recently. She's extremely impressive. And what you get from these two candidates is a sense of sincerity, a sense of, the courage that both of these people have to speak truth to power, even within their own party. And that's, anyone can criticize the other side. That's pretty easy to do. It's addressing the demons within that is hardest. And that's where you see how courageous a candidate is. And that's why I support both Bernie and Tulsi. I think they're courageous, principled progressives. And that's what we need to elect if we are going to have any hope of mitigating the worst impacts of climate change.
Well, I'm with you. I know you've got frustration over this, and I do too. And I started off the podcast here, and I know you've got other things to do today. We're going to have to let you go. But before we do, I likened you to Paul Revere. Sound the alarm as you sounded in the strongest of terms. What are we looking at here? How severe, how grave is this threat we're facing, and how imminent is it time-wise?
The timeline is now. As I said, we need to change course now. We need, both on a state level, you can push your state, as well as on a national level, we need to, step one is shut down all of the fracked gas power plants. All gas-fired power plants need to go. That needs to be step one. And anyone who's not committing to that is not really interested in solving the climate crisis. And you can do that. Really, energy policy is really formulated much more at a state level than it is at a national level. So your state is a really important site of action. Your governor, your state legislature, which is why I ran for state legislature. Fracking is the dinosaur in the room right now, and our timeline is very, very short, shorter than we know if we, haven't already missed it. But we can shut these gas-fired power plants off tomorrow if we wanted to. It is so easy to do. It's as easy as flipping the switch. What we don't have is the political will. We don't have elected officials willing to take the bold action necessary, refusing fossil fuel donations and money and influence. That's what we need. We need massive a climate strike, but we need to stop listening to the NGOs and the environmental groups, because they really don't know what they're talking about in terms of climate change. We need to listen to the science and only the science and only the scientists. And, and hopefully we'll get our act together. I mean, United States is a big consumer of power in the world, a big generator of greenhouse gas emissions. India and China are doing their part. The United States needs to step up and do its part too. So does Europe.
Well, good on you. And I'll do my part to sound the alarm as well. I'm getting on in years. I'm not a real old man at this point, but I mean, I remember when we went into the streets and we carried signs and we changed things. We stopped the war in Vietnam. If it hadn't have been for that, they'd still be killing young men and women over there, and we put an end to that. This particular threat is existential, as they say. It's not just a threat to us being drafted and possibly having to go over there and fight. It's a threat to every man, woman, and child on this planet. So we need to activate.
It unites all of us.
Yeah, we need to get it going. Absolutely. And Pramilla Malick is out there, and she's just not talking it, folks. She's walking it, and she's talking to folks like us. And God love you. Great stuff, Pramilla. Anything you want to leave us with here before we wrap up the podcast?
Just organize, mobilize, and speak truth to power.
That's
what I would say.
You can't say it any better than that. Well, that's on the Podcast by George live line, Pramilla Malick, and that's another podcast by George.